Good morning and good afternoon to you wherever you may be as you tune in today. And thank you for joining us. For those who have joined us for the first time, these conversations are focused on HR and workplace topics with a lens of talent management, workplace culture, DEI, and learning and development. I'm Sonya Sepahban, CEO of OurOffice, where we help busy HR professionals and people leaders navigate the current environment and be the most effective at what they do with a suite of time-saving products and services. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by Lori Costew, former Ford Motor Company Chief Diversity Officer, HR Strategist, and Executive Coach. Welcome, Lori.
Thank you, Sonia. I am so excited to be here. The timing couldn't be more perfect for this conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's such a pleasure to have you here. Before we get into our conversation, I want to mention that this session is approved for SHRM recertification credits, and the activity code will be shared later in the session. So please stay tuned for that. So we're going to get started with our conversation. To begin, Lori, I'm sure our audience would love to get to know you a little better. Can you please tell us a bit about yourself, especially any specific experiences, personal or professional, that have brought you to this moment in your life and in your career, and what you're focusing on now?
Absolutely. So I started at Ford Motor Company right out of my master's program. I graduated from the Ohio State University in Labor and Human Resources. Go Bucks! I'm a very proud Buckeye. And I started at a manufacturing plant in Ohio. The city is called Lima, and it stands for Lost in Middle America for a reason. So it was major culture shock for a 23-year-old. But I'll tell you what, I learned a lot about the business in the 4 years I spent in 3 different jobs at that plant. But most of my career has been in HR. Ultimately, I led multiple COEs, centers of expertise, including organization development, compliance, salary negotiations, people strategy, as well as leading HR business operations for the Lincoln Motor Company and our mobility area. But I've always had this entrepreneurial bug. And so I left HR for a period of time and I went into marketing, business development, and we actually had a business incubator for a period of time. And I guess that's the upside of being part of a large global company. You can move around a lot and stay under that same umbrella. But when I was appointed the Chief Diversity Officer, my boss at the time told me that it was my Slumdog Millionaire moment. That if you remember from the movie, everything that he knew helped him in the game show. Well, it was my background gave me so many different perspectives that are needed to institute change in a very large global space. The automotive industry is, as you well know, it is not for the faint of heart. It's a difficult, tough business. On top of the fact, Ford, very similar to auto in general, is 70% male, 70% white. And I'm sure many on this call know the challenges of being part of an old boys network and what that entails. And because of that, I'm very passionate about helping women not only learn to advocate for themselves, but learn how to get other people advocating for them when they are not in the room. So it's kind of simple about my why. It's really about helping people and organizations to thrive. And you do that in big ways, but more often you do that in small ways. I retired from Ford in 2023. And we like to say in automotive, we work in dog years. So my 30 years really translates to 210. And I certainly felt that way. About a decade ago, I became an executive coach. And since I retired, I'm enjoying my little business of executive coaching and consulting and really making progress and helping people make progress, because the impact you see through coaching, as you know, is tremendous, because leaders carry a huge shadow, and if you can help a leader become a better version of themselves, really the whole organization works really well. And on the upside of being retired, I finally have flexibility. So I enjoy spending time with my husband and 2 kids and traveling, and I have finally started exercising.
No.
Which was a big deal.
which is so important. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. I know we have a lot to talk about and take advantage of all of your varied experiences. The one thing you mentioned there about Lima, Ohio, and what it stands for, we did a lot of manufacturing in Lima, and I've been there often when I was at GD, and that's I had not heard that, so that is pretty cool. All the good things that you hear in these conversations. So, today, the title of our conversation, of course, inclusion strategies that include everyone, is really critical as we navigate the rapidly evolving workforce and also experiencing some political turmoil and division, to say the least. To frame our conversation, I thought I'd share a few facts, and these are all with very trusted sources. No fake news here, but today, women make up over 55% of all US employees, and people of color account for nearly 40%. What's more, by 2045, many studies have projected that US will become a majority minority country. You would think this is a good thing, as the recent McKinsey research shows that companies in the top quartile for diversity are 36% more likely to achieve, above average profitability, right? In another report, we see that companies with highly diverse teams report a significant increase in cash flow to the tune of 2.5 times per employee. And cash is king, right? So that one is really, to me, is always profitability, and then convert that profit to cash, right? Is what I've learned in my years of managing P&L. So given that, you would think that having a more diverse source of the workforce is a good thing, right? Because diversity, by many accounts, can be quite good for you, of course, if it's managed appropriately. Meanwhile, there are a good number of people in this country, though, who have had negative personal experiences, or at least negative impressions of DEI policies. I'll tell you, I was at a party this past weekend, and a good friend of mine was sharing, about the experiences she had had at a mid-level manager kind of a position with D&I. And we talked about that and how, of course, like everything else, these things happen, and we should continuously look to how we can address those. But I'm wondering, in your 30 years at Ford, how have you seen the changing makeup, just in general, the changing makeup of the workforce, that challenge and reshape the workplace itself, and the traditional approaches to talent management? Were there any unexpected opportunities or challenges that emerged from that evolution?
Absolutely. If you look at a question like this, it almost takes like a systems approach, a systems thinking approach, because the talent has to follow what the business needs. And so, I thought of several themes in this space. And again, with themes, there's usually no right or wrong, black or white. And with the good, there's always going to be opportunities that come with it. So, from an auto industry perspective, the explosion of software and hardware technology resulted in dramatic product changes, everything from EV to autonomous to infotainment systems, hybrid. And, we know that technology can make a lot of tasks easier, but for the impact on the workforce also is it eliminated boundaries for most of us, because now you can work from anywhere at any time. And the expectations are you're going to do that. So that's where, one thing that's hitting people. Politics and geopolitics are huge in this space. And politics has always had an issue when you think of like cafe standards. However, when you look now at a global economy with global markets, customers, plants around the world, you're dealing with wars, tariffs, intellectual property issues, and these continuing pendulum swifts, both of interest rates and DEI, and so it really puts HR in a having to react very, very quickly to things. On top of from a people perspective, you just look, we have 4 generations in the workforce right now. And while, everyone, there's commonalities across, right? Every single person on the planet has a common need to belong. So, but those different generations based on age and experience, you have different needs, you have different expectations. I know our comp and ben people, we're always looking at how do we address all these different issues for folks. And their lived experiences are shaping the view that they have. So someone who's had a long-term legacy view of the industry is going to be different than someone just coming in and understanding there's a lot of complexity that needs to be understood, but not everything has to be done the same way that it always was. COVID, I mean, when you think of how awful COVID was, but the silver lining was it allowed remote work. And that really it benefited everyone, but particularly working moms who had finally had some balance. People with disabilities had an easier time working, and many people of color felt actually more psychologically safe working at home versus being in. And I do fear this, return to office mandate in many places is actually going to cause some of that past success to go back. And then finally, the thing I'm most concerned about, and it's ramping up everywhere, is this lack of civility that's happened over the past decade. And when you look at that with your point before of the changing US demographics, and the misconceptions of what DEI is and what is not, it's really going to have an impact on business, because when people don't feel safe to bring up issues, the business is going to suffer, and people are going to either, keep their mouth shut and keep their head down, or they're going to leave and go somewhere where they might be listened to.
You make a really good point. I always thought that HR had a really tough job, but now it's like almost some days I think it's an impossible job. And you make really great points about just, the 4 generations. We're talking to an organization just yesterday, and they were talking about their Gen Zs and how most of us, or, people like in leadership, are mostly like Gen X or even boomers, right? And the expectations of life, because of how we grew up and how Gen Z has grown up through some of the, recent challenges, as you described, are just so different. And so how do you take managers that are largely from one generation and then manage all this, very vastly different type of a workforce without any understanding? So they were actually saying, it's a major pharmaceutical company, and they were saying their biggest challenge actually right now, which is under this umbrella of diversity, right? Many things are under that umbrella, is just age. And so that's like a very great point. And that everybody needs to belong. I mean, you make this point about belonging. I actually want to remind everybody, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs has belonging on it, actually, as a very fundamental need. So belonging is really not a woke word or anything, even for those that have an issue with woke words, I don't particularly, but I think, I think that it has got a bad rap. And again, in this conversations, we try and say it like it is, regardless of where our personal preferences might be, and not shy away from tough conversations, right? I think there's some words and things that have gotten a bad rap, or bad connotation, and there is some reason, right? I mean, I always think that when there is smoke, right, there's a gun, right? And there's fire, there's something going on, right? So it's not without any reason. I really sympathize, and we've been actually connecting with a lot of people, trying to reach out and ask, on LinkedIn, social media, about people's negative experiences, to see what you could do to address those, and what are the reasons why these things happened. So I think this aspect of the conversation is good, and it'll improve some of the approaches and strategies that have been in place, because at the same time, when banks failed, like our bank failed, just a couple years ago, Silicon Valley Bank. We woke up one day and our bank was not around, and so that was a pretty traumatic thing actually for us. But we didn't say let's throw out the whole banking system, right? I mean, a few banks overextended themselves, took some risks that they shouldn't have, and we set out to address that. And I think the same thing is with DEI. But I want to ask you, in hindsight yourself, what would you have done differently at Ford as it pertains, again, to implementing maybe some of the DEI approaches, strategies that y'all had.
Hindsight definitely is 2020. Let me start with a little bit of background because that'll kind of show the evolution of where we were headed, and then again where we definitely had some blind spots. And like many organizations, Ford was similar when I took over the role. Largely ignored, given lip service, but largely ignored until the murder of George Floyd. That was so egregious, and the media coverage was tremendous. Many of us were, under COVID restrictions, so we were home, and so we were watching all of that media coverage, and there was this collective experience that people had of this is just not right. And so a lot of companies then jumped on the bandwagon. We're going to start resourcing. We're making all these commitments. And sadly, most of the commitments never came through, but a lot of companies made commitments. But I am proud that we were a company that lived up to all of our commitments. It was interesting. It allowed people that had been disadvantaged to finally feel like they were being heard, that they were being listened to say, okay, yeah, this has really been my experience and primarily those would be, gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. But what I found is the chief DEI officers, every single group thought they were the most disadvantaged. And so we had to balance that tension of, we have to honor all, but we're going to do it in a way of the rising tide, raising all boats. And so I think we did a lot of things right I'll say more in the tactical space because there wasn't much infrastructure at all. So we really built a robust infrastructure of learning and development. We educated the workforce. We created an inclusive leader certification program. We had multiple events, speakers. We partnered with an outside company for an inclusion app where people could, what is this thing called Juneteenth? And they could look it up without having to ask anybody. We worked with corporate communications because our previous intranet was fine, but it was just all either articles of vehicles or our old white men leaders. And nothing wrong with them either, but we needed to show a better story. So we worked really closely in highlighting employees of all backgrounds and the contributions that they were making across the globe. I spoke on global town halls every quarter. That was a little nerve-wracking doing, 5,000 people live webinars. But we shared the demographics. We tried to put storytelling to it. We had one slide I thought that was really effective that showed little pictures of men, little pictures of women, icons, but to show this is how many men there are in the company and this is how many whites there are at the company. Really, we tried to really share that. And then in late 2020, we launched a massive DEI audit. We did this with our employees and our dealer base globally. And we collected quantitative data, qualitative data into deep employee voice because we thought we knew what most of the issues were, but we wanted our employees to tell us. And that essentially created our strategic plan. And then we were able to update employees about the actions taken to plan and what was successful and not. So that was the good stuff. However, the big
but that's a lot of great work, right? You kind of rattle them off like they're kind of like just a series of things, but because at one point, as you know, I'm an engineer and I was in aerospace and defense, but at one point I was asked to lead DEI. And at the time, I knew nothing about this. It was in 2009. I had never even belonged to the Society of Women Engineers or anything like that. And I was kind of stunned, and I had a lot of things to do. Was busy, like everybody is, and I didn't want another responsibility. And I told him, I said, I'm really not your girl. I'm not the best person for this because I have no prior experience. I've led mostly, product development groups and things like that. And I think it was because I looked the part, right? I was the only person of any diversity in the C-suite. So I was told that was not optional. And I was being, volunteered to have that second hat. And I'll tell you that from that experience, I know that just, putting together a even a networking event, having the coaching, the training, some of the things that you mentioned are hard. I remember when we did a training and we offered the same training. We didn't know any better. We offered the same training around, cultural awareness and so on to both our PhDs, and tech fellows and people like that, and to the people on the floor. And both sides didn't like it, for different reasons. And we had all this, response that was not so positive. So we learned from that. We learned that the training needs to be better, kind of tailored to the audience. We need to get some input before we go and just get everybody to go to these half-day things. So I know a lot goes into that, and you were very successful in a lot of that. So my hat is off to you, and I just want to, I think a lot of our audience knows, but still, I want to just say that my hat is off to you for doing that across such a huge organization, and so successfully in many ways. But you were going to say that was the good stuff. So now we're going to skip some
Yeah.
challenges.
The however comes in, change management 101, right? It's bringing people along the journey and addressing resistance. And I think our blind spot was just underestimating and fully understanding the breadth and the depth of fear and anger by our majority male employees who truly believe their livelihoods were at risk. And for many, their identities tied to their work. So not only did they feel they were being attacked at work, but their identity was. And clearly that wasn't the case. And, that just continued to fester at a very low level. Even though we provided data and showed this is the workforce, white males are still getting promoted at a higher rate than it. So it's not taking jobs away. It's just simply ensuring that everyone who's qualified has an opportunity. But there was still that narrative, I'm never going to get promoted. And we all know, neuroscience and our brains are very, very complex things, and confirmation bias and just like me bias are alive, well, and very strong. And some people only saw what they wanted to see and hear, and they would assume there was a natural assumption that, only if someone only looks like me, talks like me, smell like me, they're going to be qualified. So that piece, I still don't have the silver bullet idea of what we all could have done differently. We did have groups where we talked to our employees, where we would actually put a leader in with a homogenous group of people. So it could be African Americans, Hispanic, women of color, women, caregivers, veterans, and we would, as long as they weren't part of that, the leader wasn't part of that group, just to sit and listen. And like I would do white male groups because, not being a white male. And, we had some of that, but I don't think it was enough. And we really underestimated just how people were feeling. And when you have leaders who are talking, but not walking the talk, that doesn't help.
Let me ask you a tough question. I'm not trying to put you on the spot or anything. And I'll tell you in a moment why I asked this, right? I will answer that question as well. Do you think that at any point, not just at Ford, but in your other experiences where you've observed, and you don't have to say where even, right? But have you witnessed or been aware of any place where perhaps it was taken too far in the context that somebody who was not as qualified, for example, was promoted because some quota or EEO1 form didn't look good because, we got to file it with the EEOC and we got to show representation. How prevalent, let me ask it this way. I'm sure you have seen that, by the way. I would ask, how prevalent was that, do you think? Or what's your guess? Because we actually have some data I'm going to share that we just got from one of our, we have a research arm that does research on this all the time. And so I'll share some of that that's hot off the press data. But I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about, any of such observations of something like, because I hear that from people. I know it happens sometimes.
Yeah, it definitely happens. And some of the outcomes when it happens is it could be a leader who is just trying to, because they haven't they haven't grown the talent, they haven't mentored, they haven't advised, they haven't developed, and then they realize I don't have a single female or a single person of color on my team. You know, Sally is not, so we're going to try Sally. Well, the problem with that is when you don't support Sally, you don't put the support structures around Sally, and you haven't developed Sally to be able to do the job. It's almost like you put people into a job and then go, oh, look, Sally failed. Must be a DEI hire. You know, like I've seen that actually quite a bit. I've also seen people that were close to ready, and it was, okay, we're going to give a stretch, and there's no different. We give, you know, many times males are given, you know, a stretch assignment. Sometimes the difference is men tend to be better networkers at work, which is, at least from my experience, what I noticed. And they would get help from other people. Well, sometimes if there's some dissatisfaction that Sally got the job instead of Bob, well, the network's not helping Sally be successful. And so there's a lot, again, systems, when you look at the whole system, there's times when A, the person should not have been promoted, but B, they were, and they weren't given the support, so it looked like they weren't qualified.
Yeah, so you're bringing out a really good point, right? That not only there's an issue when you promote someone who's not perhaps as ready. I won't even say qualified, but as ready, because sometimes they just don't have the experience. A good example is women getting on boards, right? Many times for a board assignment, you need to have P&L responsibilities. So functional responsibilities, even if you've and if this comes as news to anyone listening, I hope that they take note of this, because it is true when you sit on a board, a public company or private, and for that matter, even nonprofits. You know, I started that nonprofit, I ended up at public boards. And I'll tell you throughout that, even for nonprofits, it's very important to have be able to, you know, appreciate a balance sheet, you know, a P&L statement, can understand capital structures, things like that, because ultimately everything is a business in the sense that you're trying to make enough money to sustain the effort, whatever that effort is. And so many women, even when they're given a lot of responsibilities, it's more functional responsibility for lots of people, but not necessarily for profit and loss. And that P&L responsibility is very important. And so sometimes women who are very capable have been given chances to be on boards when they haven't had that background, whereas it used to be like an absolute requirement, right? And that was important, because ultimately, if by a certain time in your career you haven't had that experience, then you have to be given a chance, because that woman brings another perspective, brings other, you know, lived experience that could be helpful to the organization. But then what you bring out is, okay, so some men can look at that. I have some white male friends who would tell me I have no chance of getting on a board anymore because all the board seats are going to women, and
I
people
heard
are.
the same thing.
Yeah, and I sympathize with that. I sympathize with that. But you know, there is, you know, like you say, a system level benefit, right? Sometimes that, and yet what you're pointing at is when the woman gets there, it can't just be, oh, good, we have now, you know, we're meeting what used to be the NASDAQ, for example, requirement, you know, for board diversity and this kind of thing. But we must now support this woman, A, to make her successful, and B, we must also kind of listen to what she has to say, because if there's only one, having been in these situations, if you're the only person of diversity in a room, unless there is a concerted effort to hear you out, it's hard to really make an impact. It's usually when there's two or three. I've seen myself, having been the first on some board situations, where as soon as the second one or third one comes, even though I'm pretty outspoken, you know, I see the dynamic changes, and people are, you know, it just, you know, how people listen to each other changes. So I think that's an interesting perspective you bring, that it's not just, you know, how other people feel about it. And of course, you must make sure that there's really good reason, higher level strategic reason, that you can explain to everyone why you're doing this, even though this person may not exactly be as ready as another person, but they bring other perspectives and contributions that are going to be very important. But then you must also support them so that they can actually do that. You know, the reason that you hired them. We have an input actually from someone in the Q&A line, and I appreciate people using that. It says, this is the part, this is referring to what you were just saying earlier, Lori, that white makes felt their livelihoods were under attack or threatened. That makes me very frustrated. It almost feels like gaslighting, considering all of the data we have just heard and know historically. Women and people of color have never had the same opportunities, and rarely, if they do receive equal pay for such. Will we ever reconcile this in a tactical and strategic way?
Wow, that's like it's an excellent question. I honestly don't. I agree, right? It is a gaslighting, and the data has absolutely nothing to support that feeling. And in fact, during I spoke at an all hands in India virtually, and I was asked about male discrimination. And I was very clear. I said, I've looked at your numbers, and I think they were 80% male or something, or maybe even above that. And I said, males don't have an issue with being hired and promoted because your percentage is so high. And you wouldn't believe the number of women that either text me or message me and immediately after that saying thank you, because that's what we've been trying. That's the misnomer that we've been living with all the time. The equal pay issue, I agree also. And that's why, you know, it's critical that companies do pay equity analysis. And then it's not, you just can't just do the analysis, then you have to have the budget in order to rectify. And you're not going to be able to rectify in most cases in 1 year. You got to have a longer term plan. But that piece, and it is amazing when you look at the data. And I was, in one of my jobs, I had access when I led compliance to all salaries, and it was a big aha for me. And when I went, holy crap, I am paid under what virtually everyone else is. And that was only by virtue of me being in that job, but it was pretty tough to take. But it's really, it's continually being direct and pushing back on that narrative. It's an unfair and it's a fake news. It is not, people truly believe it, but that's where you have to just be very direct and just, I disagree, and this is why, and here's the facts. And it's not something to solve. It's not going to get solved immediately, but by keeping it in the light, that does help. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. I love that answer, and I want to add to it. Will we ever reconcile this in a tactical and strategic way? I want to say this, not only we will, we must. And I mean, those companies that want to succeed, okay? Some will not, some never will. It's like, the old story of Polaroid that, went down, with Kodak, and they went down. The ones that didn't adapt to some of the new technology, the world is full of organizations that have resisted or just been oblivious to some changes in markets, in demand, in technology that have, frankly become irrelevant. So I think some will not, but those who will survive will. And there's a simple reason, I mean, people can say whatever they like, but the bottom line is that the workforce is now majority millennials and Gen Z already, and they are majority diverse and becoming more and more so. And they require that they be treated with equity, not equality necessarily, but equity, where we all know this, right? But I'm just saying, just in case anybody asks, right? I mean, I always love the example of equality is giving the same shoe size to everybody. Equity is giving them the shoe that fits, right? So that's all anybody is saying. And so I think the organizations that don't adapt, and regardless of, and by the way, we've published on what do the executive orders really say? All that's going on today is about, if you really read the fine print and you don't listen to just people opining or spreading rumors or fears, what it's really about is actually, our reading is, and we've again published on this on social media, on our own website, and it is about, stopping and banning illegal and discriminatory DEI practices, which absolutely must be stopped, right? So it is not about, you just can't treat people with equity, right? No one in their right mind would ever say that. And if they did, it would be hugely challenged. The reason those EOs have not been challenged on a legal ground is that the way they're written, they actually don't sound that bad. I mean, they sound like, and if you don't know, you haven't read them, you should read them yourself, or you could read our analysis, which we try and help with. But we did a survey because I promised that I would also share some data. We did a survey, our research arm did, on a simple question: have anyone benefited from DEI efforts or suffered because of it, or just neutral, didn't benefit or suffer from it? We let that run for a few days. We got, a couple 300 votes on it. And so certainly statistically significant number. And the data was this, right? 52% of people, so more than the diversity that's generally available in the workforce currently, said that they benefited. So clearly it benefited some people in the majority, and it was just not minorities, right? Because that 52% is a higher number than the general diversity of the workforce. About a third said that it was neutral. They didn't benefit or suffer. And about 15-16% said that they actually were harmed by DEI efforts. So then our research group reached out to these people individually, right? And to ask them anonymously to share how they were harmed, okay? So that we can understand and do something to fix it. Only 2 people responded. One gentleman said that it was a harm to him because it wasted his time. All this conversation, training, and all these things were a waste of time for him. Which, in his lived experience, that's okay, but I don't generally talk about that as real big harm. It's a waste of time. Lots of things waste our time, but it's always important to keep in mind, if it saved one courier, right? One person being paid equitably, it might waste a little bit of time, right? But then again, if there's lots of things we have to do in order to make sure, it's like when I go through TSA at the airport, it kind of wastes my time a little bit, but but if they're going to catch a terrorist, I'm all for it. And then the other lady, I tell you, one woman responded, and she described, and we, kind of followed up with her. We won't disclose her name or her company, of course, but it's a major brand that we all know, one of the largest employers in the country, that apparently there was really a situation, one of those situations where I was asking you about, right? Where, there was a person of color that was put in charge, and they really were wanting to improve their representation, probably for good reason. But the way it was implemented, she was on a fast track. She was supposed to be promoted. She was not promoted. People were actually promoted ahead of her who were not qualified. She was asked to train them. There was no explanation to her about what was in store for her or how that affected her and stuff. And then what's more is the organization started to not do as well there because, as you said, Lori, so well, those people that were put in charge were not, really supported adequately. So that's a good example of, and I said to her, at the end of all of this, you were talking about data. Data is sometimes doesn't work. Why doesn't it work, right? I mean, there's all these reports and things about some good effects. What we have found is because people don't see that data applying to them, to their specific organization, right? They're like, oh, well, Deloitte wrote this, or, McKinsey wrote this. Their customers are all, big companies that can pay $500,000 to just say hello to anybody, right? And so they don't see themselves, if they're a small, medium business, a few hundred employees, or even a few thousand employees, they don't see themselves in the same boat. And it just doesn't, they don't make that connection with it that this could also affect them. What we do is data for each organization individually, right? So you're looking at your own data, and now over 24 industries, we have tens of thousands of employees, data that we've looked at over the last several years, and organizations can see for themselves, right? They can see that if they have, 20% women, and in their highest performance ratings of exceed expectations, 40% of those are women, but their promotions are only 10% women, they can see there is something not so right there, right? So this kind of data that is specific, that is localized, we have found that actually is very eye-opening, like you said, Lori, when you looked at some of your data, right? And it really makes that connection with people.
I'm going to say yes, because during our global audit, we did the same thing. We took it right down within the function. So it wasn't just all for data. It was specific to those areas. And we had some leaders who really embraced it and owned it. And we still had leaders like, well, that's not my problem. People have moved into the department. And I mean, the sheer number of excuses was beyond, with some leaders. Some leaders really embraced it, and we did great progress made. But again, people believe the data they want to believe, and if they don't believe the data, they're going to find any excuse possible to say it's not correct. And so that's kind of where we're at. And so one of the things that I think, it's not just the data, but the story behind it, but it's also encouraging, particularly women, people of color, don't stay silent. Like so many times we're trained to accept it. You're not allowed to ask. It's like, no, it's advocating for yourself, but also advocating for others. And when they're not in the room, like I learned this early in my career. I had a girlfriend, she and I hired it at the same time. Whenever we were in meetings, we would talk about each other. And it was all about how do you rate. So she was raising awareness of me. I was raising awareness of her. And so the more people are talking about someone, you kind of go, oh, well, maybe she is qualified, right? But, women, this is a women's concept, but women tend to be a little more humble, and men tend to advocate for themselves. So even look at the research on job descriptions. If a woman, doesn't hit at least 80 to 85% of the requirements, they tend not to apply. There's research studies done on that. Whereas males, they can be only 50%. They're like, hey, I'm good. I go. So some of it is learning to really advocate and speak up, because if you're silent, no one's going to plan your career for you. So it's again, multiple levers that need to be addressed.
No, absolutely. I appreciate you adding to that with this information. We have a couple of comments that I want to address. One person asks, how are we defining diversity? And they continue that it sounds like in some places being a woman counts as diversity. That would be how you would get to the 52%. So let me address that. Diversity, the way we talk about it, and most people do because there are some national standards about that, is it includes many dimensions. It includes gender, certainly, so being a woman, absolutely, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, veteran status, disability, age. These are just some examples, right? And I think ultimately people talk about, cognitive diversity, and so there's all kinds of diversity that then you can add in, depending on what your objectives are, right? I think the same person also adds that, there's some, we should also stay away from, just categorically saying that, assuming we know how people feel about things, right? There are, for example, they talk about a woman who's a person of color, and she's very anti-DEI. Again, I think that's obviously, it's like when we assume if people of certain race or ethnicity or certain gender are, about their politics, right? And we said that is very dangerous, right? To stereotype and assume anything. And as we always say here in our team anyway, it's like questions. Questions are so good and so important. It's asking questions, and interesting questions and being curious is really a big part of, you mentioned about, people advocating for each other and speaking up and having your voice, but I think part of it also is this aspect, right? Is asking questions also, especially when we're not sure. There's another comment. Thank you for all these comments. We're having a lot of engagement here, and that's what this is about, right? That there's a lot of good information, and they appreciate the analysis of what the executive orders say. Please let us know what else you would like. We will continue to do this and try and be as unbiased and really on this, because we really want to get to the truth of what works, we're not just DEI champions, if DEI doesn't work, and I think that's the point of this comment, then we should also consider changing terminology. It says, companies seem to be doing more than reviewing practices for discriminatory DEI practices. Do you think there's a risk to continue our practices for inclusion? What do you think about that?
I think there's a bigger risk if you don't continue your practices for inclusion. Again, it's a fundamental human need to belong. And if people want to grow their careers, they're not going to stay at a company, especially Gen Z and late millennials. They're not going to stay anywhere where they're not feeling valued, developed, and growing. And, boomers and to extent Xers, they didn't move around as much. And so there's still that thing that, oh, well, I own you as the company. Well, no, because now younger generations are voting with their feet. The economy plays a role in how fast that they do that, but there's a bigger risk of not keeping. And actually, when ERGs I saw part of that question. So for decades, Ford had ERGs, but they kind of got neglected. They were kind of on their own. And one of the things we did was we really put a lot of foundational support behind those ERGs. Again, rising tide raises all boats. They had their own goals and objectives and identity, but they fully supported each other. And, that power of collective voice is very, very strong. They attended each other's events. They educated each other. Like a great example was the chairman of Ford Pride and the chairman of our veterans group. They would go to the manufacturing facilities together and set up a table and talk about both of the ERGs. So, people like to have that identity. They like having people near them. Our Asian Indian ERG, from a business perspective, they had a big event where they sold thousands, or I should say, over the years, thousands of vehicles. So there's a business reason for these, as well as a place where people can come together and share their experiences, be connected to someone. I think getting rid of ERGs is one of the biggest mistakes an organization can do. You just need to make sure they're open up to everyone. So we called it allies. So I was a member of every single ERG as an ally.
Absolutely. There's some, again, misconceptions and sometimes misimplementations of things, right? And I think ERGs, if they don't include allies, right, how effective are they really going to be, right? The point of an ERG is just, it's a topic, right? It's to focus the topic. But again, if the language is becoming too sensitive in some areas, I think you make a very good point that it's really not a choice not to be inclusive and not to make your employees feel like they belong. But of course, I want to recognize the challenge in doing that, given some of the executive orders and some of the things that we hear. And we'll come back to that in a moment. I just want to emphasize something that you just said, Lori, about people will leave, you won't be able to retain them and so on. Why is that important? When you look at our country, as a whole, in terms of some, skills that we know today is so important. Now, every skill is important, but one that affects everyone, and we are in quite a bit behind other countries, is engineering, right? Our adversaries, when you look at countries like, North Korea and others, there's many of them. I don't want to go into that and make this sound political at all. But there are adversaries, right? And they have per capita, they have 4 engineers per capita to one that we have, so it's 4x, 4 times per capita number of engineers. How are we going to, how are we going to catch up with that? We just don't have enough people. When you think of it, even at 300 million plus numbers that we're only 5% or less of the whole, world. So it's like, there's just not enough workforce, with our population that we can compete adequately with the other. And that's why areas like Silicon Valley are over majority foreign born, right? I mean, and that's where a lot of our technology has come from, at least in certain types of technology, right? So again, I think it's a necessity to have every woman, every disabled person, every young person, different degrees of diversity, that we encourage them to get into these skills areas and into these disciplines that have historically been very much not diverse. It's just a matter of numbers. We just need to get the numbers. And so again, I wonder if you have anything else you want to add to that.
Oh, I mean, we could have a whole other hour just on the importance of pipelining and, and a lot of these programs are intended, we worked really closely with our philanthropy team, and we were doing things at the elementary, middle school level, getting kids into robotics, getting, girls in STEM, again, just to create that pipeline that at some point in time, they might come to Ford Motor Company. And so that's the misnomer so much about you're doing things separately. Well, not exactly, but.
Well, and I'll just share a personal anecdote. I mean, it's anecdotal, actually. I understand it's not, data as such, but you can take it for what it means to you. When I was first joined a C-suite that had been all white males forever for the previous 50 years before me, when I showed up there, this was in the 2009 timeframe, I was told even when I was just announced, I hadn't even arrived. And the president of the division that I was reporting to told me that there was one top engineer woman who had come to him specifically to say that she had thought that she wouldn't have, the kind of opportunities as a woman in aerospace and defense. And she was thinking of taking her engineering expertise and take it to a different industry altogether. But when I was announced, as a woman coming in to take over a big part of the business, that she was going to now wait and see about this woman showing up. And so the president was telling me this as a joking thing that, hey, you're already benefiting us, right? I mean, just by your name being announced. And that's what people really think of, right? I mean, it's what they see. And when you think of, there was this, makes me think of the cosmetic brand ELF, ELF, right? I must make a mention. They had an ad that was running last year, actually, right? And it said, "So many dicks."
I thought.
It, yeah. And the "so many dicks,"
Yeah.
it stood for, what they meant by that was that they did an analysis that there were more men whose name was, first name Dick, that were on boards of public companies, than there were women altogether, women of any name. And that was why. And by the way, I have to shout out to ALF, because their CEO Tarang Amin has been quite vocal, and they just posted their 24th consecutive quarters of exceeding expectations and growing the business. And they've grown, I think, I can't remember exactly the numbers, but it's like either 500% in 7 years or 700% in 5 years. But anyway, it's some huge percentage over a short number of years. I think it's actually 700% over 5 years. And you know, just astounding success. You look at Costco, you know, astounding success. They pushed back on some activists. And so there is a question here about, you know, how do we comply with the law? You know, are the executive orders legal, or if we're not in, you know, in compliance with it, or is there something illegal we're doing? The fact of the matter is, again, please refer to our analysis. I'm happy if anybody shares their email address, by the way, if they want sources or links or data, we're happy to share it, but you'll need to share your email address so we can get back with you. And in this case, I will say that, you know, we've done analysis, and I'm reading at least, you know, the EOs themselves, the two especially that we analyzed that were issued on January 20th and 21st, are not illegal themselves, but so they are fully legal. But, you know, again, it's the fine reading of it, of what does it mean? And of course, an important thing is, you know, the response, you know, how that's implemented, right? So there'll be some, you know, implementation of that we'll see in the months. And there was a 120-day period by which there'll be more information about how they intend to implement this. The Attorney General is tasked to actually do that together with OMB, I believe. So we'll hear about that.
And if I could jump in, you know, there's a lot of things that are within your control. So this is all about like control the controllables right now. And so there's things that you can do that are around auditing. So you audit all of your people's systems, processes, policies across the employee journey, starting from recruiting, hiring, development, comp and ben, promotion, exit. There's always bias and bureaucracy built in, and everyone hates bureaucracy regardless of your race or your gender, right? How do you make it easier to be an employee? What are your company values? In many cases, values match what we say is important in the DEI space. So it's not DEI, you're talking about, you're connecting it to your values. And this is where you can use yourself and to use your agency. So when you see people parroting, oh, it's just a DEI hire, stop that in the moment. And to your point, around asking questions. So, you know, curiosity is a great tool, and the brain triggers on questions. So you can open up people's mind with simple things like, tell me more. Well, is that true? How do you know it's true? Because we need these different perspectives in order to reach a changing market. And so if you're looking at a homogenous group asking the question, well, is there anyone here with expertise that are going to tell us we're hitting the mark or not? So questions are safer to be received than statements are. And so everyone has the agency to do that. And HR teams have the agency to control those controllables and work where there's bias. There's no executive order saying you can't remove bias from your systems and processes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, again, goes back to the fear and everything. I must ask you in the last couple of minutes, there are some other comments, you know, about immigrants and so on. Frankly, we can't comment on whether closing the border to all immigrants, not just criminals, is, you know, what that means. That's just not our area of expertise in terms of you know, the border management and so on. But we are happy to answer any and all questions. I put my LinkedIn in the messages. I will also put my email address, so please stay in touch with us, and Lori can do the same. You can ask us to connect you with her as well. I'm sure to the extent she has time to connect afterwards. But we need to keep, but my big message, and I'm going to ask you about your big message, especially with government employee firings and all the things that are going on, you know, merit versus DEI, all these things, anything you want to say at the end. But the one thing I want to say is it's important to keep the conversation going. What the thing that Lori has told us over and over again in this conversation is it's important to keep the conversation going. And there's easy ways to do it. The reason I put my LinkedIn, I'm not, you know, I don't need more followers or anything like that, but I will tell you that when there is a post, and some of our recent posts, the one where we had Serena Williams, the one with Jamie Dimon, these have gone viral pretty much on whatever can be considered viral, at least for us. We get tens of thousands of impressions and hundreds of reactions and repostings. I guess for us, for me at least, at my little scope, it's viral a little bit. And it's because, it really surfaces what's going on. And you can simply just repost that. If you repost it or comment and get into the conversation, it's an easy way to keep the conversation going. Lori,
Um,
you for it.
And I would say start with yourself. It's a very crazy time right now, but you can't be effective if you're living in a state of fear or feeling overwhelmed. Curiosity that we've already talked about, it's so easy to get pulled into the emotion. So you stay curious, emotionally kind of unpack things. So for example, I recently watched the documentary on the founder of the Oath Keepers. Was that something I had any interest in? No, my knee jerk was, no way in heck am I going to watch that. I learned a lot. I didn't agree, but I learned a lot. So listen for understanding. It doesn't mean agreement, but when you can understand the fears and the concerns, there's usually something there. There's a lot of bluster on top of it. And then once you understand those fears and concerns, you can find a way to communicate the facts.
Thank you so much. We like to, end on time, but we could continue this conversation for a long time. We do have these conversations on an ongoing basis, probably more and more frequently now. And we appreciate all of your inputs throughout the process. It is so important to stay engaged. We must stay engaged and we must find time for it. I know everybody's busy, but we must find time for it. Thank you so much. Until the next time. Bye-bye.